Rome had seen power corrupt men before. It was almost the expected outcome. But in 161 AD, something different sat on the throne. A man who had spent 20 years studying how to want nothing, placed in charge of everything. Marcus Aurelius ruled the largest empire in the Western world, commanded armies he never wanted, decided the fates of men he had never met, and went home each night to write, in private, in a language his court could not easily read, that he had fallen short again. He never published those notes. He never intended anyone to find them. He is remembered today as the philosopher king, proof that wisdom and power can share the same man without either one destroying the other. The problem is what happened next. The reign of Marcus Aurelius ended with his son on the throne. That son was Commodus, a man who fought gladiators in the arena, renamed Rome after himself, and sent the empire into a crisis it would spend a century trying to climb out of. Both of these things are true. The philosopher and the catastrophe he left behind are both true. And somewhere in that gap, between the man who wrote the most admired private journal in human history and the world he left when he died, is something far more honest and far more extraordinary than the legend. In the spring of 121 AD, a boy was born on the Caelian Hill in Rome, in a garden villa overlooking the city. His father was a praetor. His grandfather had been consul 3 times. His family had Spanish roots and a fortune built on olive oil and brickworks. And they had been climbing the ladder of Roman power for 3 generations with the patient efficiency of people who understood that empires rewarded consistency. The boy was named Marcus. He would not keep that name for long. Rome at that moment was close to the peak of everything it would ever be. The empire stretched from Hadrian's Wall in the north of Britain to the upper reaches of the Nile in Egypt, from the Atlantic coast of Morocco to the Euphrates in modern Iraq. Its population was somewhere around 70 million people, roughly a third of everyone alive on Earth at the time. Goods moved through its ports in volumes that would not be approached again in the Mediterranean for more than 1,000 years. Grain from Egypt fed the city of Rome, which held more than 1 million people. Silk arrived from China, pepper from India, and ivory from sub-Saharan Africa, carried north through trade networks that stretched beyond the edge of every Roman map. The roads made it possible. Some 50,000 miles of paved road connected every corner of the empire to every other corner, built on a scale that assumed permanence. A merchant could travel from Britain to Syria without leaving Roman territory. A letter sent from Rome could reach the governor of Egypt in 2 weeks. The postal system, the cursus publicus, moved official messages across the empire at speeds that would not be matched by any government in Europe until the 19th century. The infrastructure was not decoration. It was the physical skeleton of the largest administrative project in the ancient world, and in 121 AD it was still being built. The emperor was Hadrian. But he had taken the throne in 117 and spent his reign not extending the borders, as his predecessor Trajan had done, but consolidating what already existed, touring the provinces in person, inspecting the legions, building the wall across northern Britain that still bears his name. He was an unusual emperor, curious, well-read, an architect and a hunter, a man who spent more time outside Rome than inside it. His court was cosmopolitan and educated. The empire he administered was not at war with any major power. For the first time in generations, there was something that could plausibly be called peace. The system that produced this stability rested on a single fragile principle. The emperor chose his successor, not by blood, but by judgment. The 5 men who had ruled Rome since Nerva's accession in 96 AD had each identified the best available candidate and adopted him as a son. Nerva had adopted Trajan. Trajan had adopted Hadrian. Each transfer had been deliberate, each successor selected for capacity rather than birth. The result was the longest unbroken sequence of competent rule in Rome's history, and the empire showed it. The philosopher Aelius Aristides, writing in the 140s, described a world in which the whole civilized earth lived as if in a common fatherland. That was the world Marcus Aurelius was born into. His father died when he was 3 years old. The cause is not recorded. Marcus was raised by his grandfather in the family's large residence on the Lateran, not far from the Caelian villa where he had been born. That his mother was present, but his grandfather was the dominant figure. A serious man, 3 times consul, deeply embedded in the upper tier of Roman public life. From him, Marcus absorbed what his later writing would identify as the first virtues: a calm temperament, distaste for bad behavior in others, and the habit of measuring himself against his own standard rather than anyone else's. He was a quiet, serious child in a family that had spent decades becoming the kind of family emperors noticed. Hadrian noticed. The precise nature of his interest in the boy is unclear. The family connections ran close to the imperial circle through a tangle of marriages and adoptions, and Rome's governing class operated on relationships too dense to unpick cleanly. What is clear is that Hadrian began paying attention to Marcus early, and that his attention was specific and deliberate. When Marcus was 6, Hadrian enrolled him in the equestrian order, a formal legal status that placed him among the second rank of Rome's elite, and opened the cursus honorum, the ladder of public offices. When Marcus was 8, Hadrian appointed him to the Caelian priests, one of the most ancient colleges of Roman religious life. Both appointments were unusual for a boy his age. Both were the actions of a man with a plan. Hadrian called him verissimus, most truthful. The nickname stuck because it was accurate. Marcus had developed a reputation, even as a child, for refusing to say things he did not mean. Among the Roman aristocracy, where dissembling and flattery were professional skills as much as social ones, this was conspicuous. It was also, in the particular way of Roman compliments, a quality Hadrian valued in a boy he was already thinking about as part of Rome's future. An emperor needed honest people around him. An empire this large, running on information filtered through layers of officials and courtiers, ran the constant risk of hearing only what those officials thought the emperor wanted to hear. A boy who couldn't bring himself to flatter was a useful thing. At 15, Marcus put on the toga virilis, the plain white adult toga that marked the formal end of Roman boyhood, and entered the next phase of his preparation. Hadrian had him named prefect of the city during the Latin festival, a ceremonial post that nonetheless placed him at the head of Rome's administration for its duration. He acquitted himself, by all accounts, yet with the same seriousness he had brought to everything else. He was visible at public banquets, at the magistrates' courts, at the functions that composed the daily ritual of Roman public life, present, composed, doing what was required, apparently without either relishing it or resenting it. He was 15, and he was already performing the role that had been assigned to him with the disciplined attention of someone who understood that performance was the job. In 136, Hadrian announced his first choice of successor, a senator named Lucius Ceionius Commodus, who took the imperial name Aelius Caesar. Marcus was betrothed to Aelius's daughter, Caeonia Fabia, as part of the arrangement, a move that tied the boy to the imperial succession without making him the direct heir. Then, on the first day of 138, but Aelius Caesar died of a hemorrhage before he could make the speech he had prepared for the Senate. Hadrian was gravely ill. He needed a new plan, and he had very little time. He turned to a 51-year-old senator named Antoninus, the husband of Marcus's aunt Faustina, and adopted him as successor, on one condition. Antoninus had to adopt Marcus as his own son. Marcus reportedly received this news with sadness, rather than the excitement that a place in the imperial succession might have been expected to produce. He was 16. He had been living in his mother's house and was moved, reluctantly, to Hadrian's private residence to begin the formal process of becoming a Caesar. His betrothal to Caeonia Fabia was annulled. He was now engaged to Faustina the Younger, the daughter of his new adoptive father, a rearrangement of affections that no one asked him about and that was completed in the same bureaucratic register as everything else. It was the moment his life ceased to be his own in any ordinary sense, and the boy who couldn't bring himself to say things he didn't mean had no honest response to give except the one he gave decades later, in a private journal no one was supposed to read, that the purple dye was a thing to be careful of, and that a man could drown in it without noticing. Hadrian died in July 138. Antoninus became emperor and took the name Pius. Marcus was made Caesar, junior emperor, heir apparent, and began the long apprenticeship that would define the next 23 years of his life. He was 17, the man who would be responsible for 40 million people, who would fight wars he never wanted and watch a plague kill a fifth of his empire's population, had just traded his mother's house on the Caelian Hill for a position in the succession of the most powerful state in the Western world. He did not want it. He went anyway. The empire he was being prepared to inherit was, by every measurable standard, at its height. The treasury was in surplus, the frontiers were largely quiet, the cities were building, the roads were carrying more traffic than they had ever carried. At the center of it all sat Rome itself, a city of temples and insulas and markets and aqueducts, of grain warehouses and gladiatorial schools and public baths that could hold 3,000 people at a time. The smell of the city, wood smoke, dung, bakeries, the river, filled the morning air on the Caelian Hill. But on a clear day, you could see the whole of it from there. Tile rooftops and marble monuments, the Forum below, the Palatine Hill to the west with the imperial palaces sprawling across its summit. Marcus had grown up looking at it. In a few decades, it would all be his. What no one standing on that hill in 138 AD could have seen was that the high point had already passed. The treasury surplus would be spent. The quiet frontiers would move. The plague was already somewhere in Central Asia, working its way west through trade routes that connected every corner of the world Rome had built. The 5 good emperors had produced a century of continuity by choosing their successors carefully, and the 6th emperor had just been chosen as a 16-year-old boy, not by the man responsible for the choice, but by the complicated arithmetic of Roman dynastic politics. Marcus Aurelius would inherit the most powerful empire in the world and spend most of his reign trying to hold it where he found it. He would not quite succeed. But what the trying cost him and what he made of it, is the story. The education of a Roman aristocrat was a serious and highly structured affair. It began at home, under private tutors, and moved through grammar and rhetoric toward the public world of oratory, the art of persuasion, the skill on which Roman public life ran. For the heir apparent to the most powerful throne in the world, the standard was higher still. Marcus Aurelius had his first lessons in a garden villa on the Caelian Hill, surrounded by men chosen by an emperor. By the time he was 17, he had tutors for Greek grammar, a Latin rhetoric, geometry, drama, and philosophy simultaneously. The education was not incidental to who he became. It was the arena in which the conflict at the center of his life began. The man who shaped Marcus's early intellectual formation most visibly was Marcus Cornelius Fronto, the leading orator in Rome and probably the most celebrated rhetorician of his generation. Fronto had an empire-wide reputation. Students came from across the Mediterranean to hear him. He was, by the standards of his time, the equivalent of a man who could fill a lecture hall, and he was Marcus's Latin tutor for the better part of a decade. Their correspondence survives in fragments, and it is one of the more unexpected documents of the ancient world, genuinely warm, full of affectionate teasing, then and occasionally revealing about the tension between what Fronto was teaching Marcus to do and what Marcus was increasingly inclined to become. Fronto was not a philosopher. He had no patience for philosophy, and he said so clearly. His world was words, the precise, polished, persuasive management of an audience. For Fronto, rhetoric was the supreme human art because power ran on it. Emperors addressed their senate, generals addressed their legions, governors issued edicts. A man who could not speak with authority was a man whose authority would be perpetually questioned. Marcus needed to be able to stand before the Roman Senate and command the room. Fronto believed, with the certainty of a man who had built his life on the premise, that philosophy was a distraction from that preparation. Worse, a seduction. He once warned Marcus that tasting philosophy without committing to it fully was more dangerous than never tasting it at all. Marcus tasted it anyway. Apollonius of Chalcedon was probably his first philosophy teacher, arriving at the imperial household while Marcus was still being adopted into it. He was a Stoic, serious, rigorous, and disciplined in his living to the point that Antoninus Pius had to summon him from Chalcedon to Rome, since Apollonius refused to travel to an emperor on general principle, and the emperor had to point out with some amusement that this inflexibility was itself a form of pride. Marcus thanked Apollonius later for the lesson that a man could combine intensity and relaxation, and for never making his students feel that they were the fortunate ones for being taught by him. It was Apollonius who first showed Marcus that philosophy was not a set of propositions to be memorized, but a way of holding yourself in relation to the world. The turn came through reading. Rusticus, Quintus Junius Rusticus, Stoic senator, consul, and the man Marcus later called his most important philosophical influence, gave him a copy of the notes on Epictetus's lectures. Epictetus had died around 135 AD, while Marcus was still a teenager, so they never met. But what Marcus found in those notes hit him with the force of something he had already half believed and had not yet found words for. He wrote to Fronto sometime between 145 and 147 that reading the Stoic philosopher Aristo of Chios had filled him with such joy that he was ashamed of himself, and that he could no longer argue opposite sides of the same question, as rhetoric required. That was the letter in which Marcus told his beloved tutor, in effect, that he was leaving rhetoric behind. Fronto was not pleased. He wrote back that even Zeno and Cleanthes, the founders of Stoicism, wore a philosopher's rough wool cape, not an emperor's purple. The irony ran deep, because Epictetus was the least likely source of inspiration for a Caesar. He had been born a slave in Hierapolis, in what is now western Turkey, probably around 50 AD. His name meant simply acquired, a thing that had been obtained by someone else. His master, Epaphroditus, was a wealthy freedman who had served as secretary to Nero. Epictetus studied philosophy while enslaved, was eventually freed, opened a school in Rome, was expelled when Domitian banished philosophers from the city, and lived the rest of his life in Nicopolis in Greece, teaching in plain language from a simple house with few possessions. When he died, someone bought his clay oil lamp for 3,000 drachmas because it had been his. The man whose ideas would shape an emperor had owned almost nothing. What Epictetus taught was not complicated in its essence, though it took a lifetime to practice. Everything in the world falls into one of two categories: things that are within your control and things that are not. Within your control are your own judgments, your own desires, your own responses. Outside it is everything else: your body, your reputation, your property, the opinions of other people, the actions of fate. The man who spends his life trying to control what he cannot control will be permanently miserable. The man who learns to work only on what he can control will be permanently free. Epictetus had developed this position from the specific experience of being a slave, a man whose body, whose labor, whose physical freedom belonged to someone else. He had nothing left but his mind, and his mind, he decided, no one could touch. For Marcus, the collision between this teaching and his life was immediate and obvious. He was the opposite of Epictetus in every external circumstance. His body belonged to him. His property was enormous. His reputation was the most carefully managed in the empire. And yet he was also, in a very precise sense, a slave to his duty, to his position, to the plans that Hadrian and Antoninus had made for him before he had any say in the matter. He had not chosen to be Caesar. That he had not chosen to marry Faustina or live in the house of Tiberius, or attend the endless ceremonial functions that composed the texture of imperial life. Epictetus's philosophy offered him a framework for bearing what he had not chosen, not by resisting it, not by pretending to love it, but by locating the one thing no circumstance could reach, the quality of his own internal response. Rusticus, who had introduced him to that framework, was himself a particular kind of teacher. 20 years older than Marcus, he was the grandson of Aurelianus Rusticus, a man who had been condemned to death by the Emperor Domitian for writing too honestly about a political martyr. Rusticus came from a tradition in which philosophy and courage were the same thing. What Marcus found in him was not the warmth of Fronto or the serenity of Apollonius, but something more demanding, a man who would tell him plainly when he was wrong. Marcus noted in the first book of the Meditations that he often felt anger at Rusticus and was grateful he had never acted on it. That was the quality Marcus most needed in a teacher, someone who wouldn't adjust the criticism to spare the heir apparent's feelings. From Rusticus, he learned, by his own account, not to be drawn toward rhetoric, not to write speculative treatises, not to deliver moral sermons, not to dress up as a philosopher in public. He learned to write letters simply, as a person rather than as a position. He learned to read carefully, not at speed. He learned that correction of character was a process, not an event, that the work of becoming a better person was not something that could be completed and set aside, but something that had to be returned to every day, addressed again, found wanting again, addressed again. This was the mode of thought that would eventually produce the Meditations, the private, daily, never-finished practice of a man examining the gap between what he intended and what he did. There is a detail in Marcus's early years that points at the coming conflict with a precision that later events confirm. While the imperial household sent Apollonius to teach Marcus philosophy, Apollonius walked to the palace every day from his rented room rather than moving in. When someone asked why the philosopher didn't simply take up residence there, Apollonius replied that one does not come to the emperor comes to philosophy. But Marcus was the one who walked to Apollonius's room, even after becoming Caesar. But he would leave the palace and go to his teacher, because he understood, at some level, that his formal position could not acknowledge publicly, that Apollonius had something the palace could not provide. The palace had power. Apollonius had something more useful, a way of sitting inside power without being destroyed by it. The tension between Fronto and the Stoics was not merely a tutor's disagreement. It was the same tension that would define Marcus's entire reign. Rhetoric asked a man to argue any side convincingly, to adapt his presentation to his audience, to persuade. Stoicism asked a man to mean what he said, to be consistent regardless of audience, to hold to what was true even when it was inconvenient. An emperor needed both. But he had to address the Senate with authority and manage the expectations of a court that ran on flattery and performance. He also had to govern with some attachment to justice and truth if the administration was not to collapse into self-serving corruption. Marcus spent his apprenticeship under Antoninus, learning how those two demands could be held simultaneously, and writing to Fronto about rhetoric and to himself, eventually, about why rhetoric was never going to be enough. By the time Antoninus Pius died in 161, Marcus had been in formal preparation for the throne for 23 years. He had been consul twice. He had managed petitions, read imperial letters to the Senate, taken on administrative work that increased steadily as Antoninus aged. He had married Faustina, who would bear him at least 13 children, in most of whom would die before him. He had read Epictetus until the framework was part of how he thought, not merely something he could quote, and he had been told, in effect, by Fronto, by Rusticus, by Apollonius, by Antoninus himself, by the whole structure of his preparation, that his job was to hold the empire together, and by Stoicism that the empire, the power, the reputation, and the survival of his children were all things outside his control, and that only the quality of his own choices remained fully his. He was 40 years old. The gap between those two sets of instructions was the space he would spend the next 19 years trying to inhabit. Fronto was still writing to him when Marcus became emperor. He told his former pupil that the early days of the reign were the happiest of his life, that Marcus was beloved, capable, eloquent when the moment demanded it. He also reminded him that a philosopher's woolcloth was not imperial purple, and that the role required more than virtue. He was right, and Marcus knew it. What Fronto perhaps did not fully understand was that Marcus also knew virtue was the only thing the role could not supply, that the empire would press him to be many things he did not want to be, and that the philosophy he had spent 20 years absorbing was not an ornament for a good life. It was the equipment he intended to use for surviving the one he actually had. Sometime in the 170s AD, probably in a military camp on the Danube Frontier, the emperor of Rome picked up a stylus and began writing to himself, not to a correspondent, not to posterity. To himself, in the second person, and in a language his Latin-speaking court could not easily read. Greek, the language of philosophy, the language of the world Marcus Aurelius thought in when he was thinking seriously. The notes he produced over the following decade were not a book. He gave them no title, no structure, no organization beyond the loose sorting into 12 sections that later hands imposed on them. He never prepared them for publication, never revised them for an audience, never showed them to a reader he trusted. When he died in 180 AD, they were found among his private papers. They survive today because whoever found them understood against all probability that they were worth keeping. The title we know them by, Meditations, was added by later editors. Marcus himself called the work, insofar as he called it anything, ta eis houten, things to himself. The phrase is more honest than the word we now use, which implies a settled, deliberate practice of spiritual reflection. What Marcus was actually doing was something raw. He was writing commands, reminders, reproaches. The entries often begin in the second person. You must, do not forget. Remember that. He was not meditating on truths he had mastered. He was nagging himself about truths he kept forgetting. The repetitions that modern readers sometimes find tedious are not the carelessness of a man who didn't revise. They are the evidence of a man who needed to hear the same thing again because the previous hearing had not been enough. The first book stands apart from everything that follows. It is a list of debts, not financial but moral. The debts of character that a person accumulates over a lifetime from the people who shaped them. From his grandfather, good morals and control of temper. From his father, whom he never knew, the account of a man with mildness and resolution and no vanity about honors. From his mother, piety, generosity, simplicity, the avoidance of wrongdoing and even the thought of it. From his teacher, Diognetus, to sleep on a hard bed, to wear the plain wool cloak, to disbelieve miracle workers. From Rusticus, the willingness to be corrected, the discipline to avoid rhetoric, the introduction to Epictetus. From Apollonius, moral freedom, the ability to ignore the dice of fortune, the steadiness to be unchanged by sudden pain or loss. The list goes on for 17 entries, naming everyone from tutors to gods, and it ends with thanks that he was not corrupted by the court earlier than he was. What is striking about that first book, read carefully, is what it does not contain. There is no pride. There is no claim of achievement. The most powerful man in the world, writing privately, with no audience to perform for, describes himself entirely as a product of other people's influence, and then spends 11 more books arguing with himself about whether he has managed to live up to what those people gave him. The answer, in entry after entry, is no. Not fully. Not consistently. The Meditations are not a record of wisdom achieved. They are a record of the distance between what Marcus believed and what he managed to do on a given day, and the effort required to close that distance the following morning. Now, he wrote in Greek because the court spoke Latin, and privacy mattered. An emperor in the Roman world had almost no private life. His meals, his movements, his public appearances, his correspondence were all embedded in a structure of ceremony and observation. Greek was a small screen. Not a perfect one, since educated Romans read Greek, but enough to make casual discovery less likely. He was not hiding from his enemies. He was hiding from the whole machinery of expectation and performance that a man in his position was required to feed constantly. In the Greek notes, he could say things that he could not say in Latin without them becoming statements, things like, I am trying and failing and trying again, which sounds like philosophy in Greek and sounds like weakness in the language of imperial administration. The structure of the remaining 11 books is not a structure in any conventional sense. Each entry is its own thing, a sentence, a paragraph, occasionally a longer reflection, with no connection to what comes before or after, beyond the fact that the same man wrote all of them. Some entries are commands: wake early, do not complain, do not be distracted by what others think. Some are philosophical arguments running through the logic of why fear of death is irrational or why anger at other people is a misunderstanding of how people work. Some are quotations from other writers, Epictetus, Heraclitus, Plato, that Marcus was collecting the way a person in a difficult situation collects anything that helps them stay upright. Some are very short, a single line, often something that sounds like a man reaching for a handhold. The obstacle is the way. The repetition across the 12 books is not an accident and not a failure of organization. Marcus was doing what Epictetus had advised, writing down the principles daily so that they would be available when the day required them. A Stoic principle encountered in the morning and not used is a principle that atrophies. The writing was the practice, the equivalent of what a musician does at scales, not because scales are the goal, but because scales are how the fingers stay ready for the goal. Marcus kept returning to the same handful of ideas: the transience of all things, the importance of living in the present moment, the distinction between what is and what is not within his control. The duty to act for the common good, not because he had not grasped them, but because grasping them in abstract was entirely different from holding them in place while an empire pressed on him from every direction. One theme runs through the Meditations with more urgency than any other: impermanence. Everything passes. Every man who ever seemed great is now forgotten or will be. The emperors before Marcus, Augustus, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, are already becoming names rather than presences. The philosophers who seemed to define the age through which they lived, where are they now? The cities, the armies, the court intrigues that consumed whole lives, all of it dissolves. Marcus returned to this not as despair but as relief, and the distinction is philosophically significant. If everything passes, and then the things that are currently pressing on him, the plague deaths, the frontier wars, the 1,000 petitions that landed on his desk each morning, also pass. He is not required to fix the universe. He is required to do his part of it today as well as he can, and then let the rest go. Death appears constantly, not morbidly. Marcus was not writing a document of depression, but practically as a tool for sharpening the present. He noted that Marcus Aurelius, emperor of Rome, would one day be as forgotten as the men who came before him. He noted that the body was a temporary structure, and the soul, whatever the soul was not something that outlasted the body in any comfortable way he could be certain of. He wrote about dying in ways that suggest a man who thought about it regularly and had reached, not peace exactly, but a workable equilibrium. The Meditations are not the work of a happy man. They are the work of a man who has decided that happiness in the conventional sense is not available to him and has moved on to the harder question of what is available. What makes the Meditations unlike any other philosophical text in the ancient world is the specific absence of an audience. Every other philosophical work we have from antiquity was written to persuade someone of something: a student, a reader, posterity. The Stoic letters of Seneca were addressed to Lucilius. The discourses of Epictetus were recorded by a student for other students. Even private diaries in the ancient world were often composed with a consciousness of eventual readers. Marcus's notes have none of that texture. He does not explain. He does not build toward a conclusion. He does not make himself look good. He does not spare himself. When he notes in the Meditations that he is still struggling with anger or with distraction or with the temptation to spend time at the court pursuing comfort rather than duty, he is not confessing to a reader who will forgive him. He is noting a failure in a ledger he maintains for his own use. The philosopher Pierre Hadot, who spent decades studying the Meditations with more care than almost any other modern reader, described them as spiritual exercises in the most specific sense. Practices performed on the self, not communications about the self. The point was not to record what Marcus believed. The point was to make what he believed functional, to close the gap between the Stoic framework he had absorbed over decades of study and the moment-to-moment reality of governing an empire in crisis. Every entry was a tool. Some of them were very short because short was what the moment could absorb. Some of them returned to the same territory because that territory kept giving way underfoot and needed to be reoccupied daily. The Meditations are not a monument to a man who had achieved Stoic wisdom. They are the working notes of a man who was trying to achieve it under the worst possible conditions every day until he died. The popular reception of the Meditations has consistently misread them in the same direction. As a record of wisdom, a testament to what can be achieved when a good man holds power. The book sells millions of copies because people treat it as evidence that philosophy works. that a person who believes the right things and practices the right habits can become the serene, unshakable figure the popular image of Marcus Aurelius suggests. But the Meditations do not support that reading. They support the opposite. They are the evidence that Marcus Aurelius found the Stoic standard almost impossibly difficult to meet, that he returned to the same failures repeatedly, and that the gap between his ideal and his performance was something he lived with rather than closed. What the Meditations actually say about Marcus Aurelius is not what the mythology says. They say he was trying. They say he never stopped. They say it cost him. The last datable entry in the Meditations was written, almost certainly, near the end of Marcus's life, on campaign, in the cold of a northern winter, with the plague still moving through the provinces and the frontier wars entering their second decade. He was nearly 60. He had been emperor for close to 20 years. He was dying, though he may not yet have known how close the end was. And he was still writing the same kinds of notes he had written at the beginning, still reminding himself to be present, to act well, to remember that all of it would pass. Not because he had failed to learn, because the learning was not something that could be completed. It was something that had to be done again tomorrow and the day after, for as long as there was a tomorrow to do it in. The first mention of the Meditations by another writer dates from around the 10th century, more than 700 years after Marcus died. For most of those centuries, the notes survived in a single manuscript, probably passed down through whoever managed the imperial archives after his death, copied carefully enough to outlast the empire that produced them. The bishop who sent a copy to a colleague around 907 AD described it as very old and falling to pieces, which is how something survives for 7 centuries. It was first printed in 1559 from a manuscript that has since been lost. The book that is now read by millions existed for most of its history as a nearly vanished thing, a private conversation between a man and himself, conducted in a borrowed language never intended to leave the room where it was written. On the 7th of March, 161 AD, Antoninus Pius died at his estate at Lorium, about 19 kilometers from Rome. He had been at the table the evening before, eating Alpine cheese rather greedily, and by the following afternoon, he was gone. His last recorded word was the watchword he gave the night tribune, equanimitas, equanimity. It was the watchword of a man who had spent 23 years governing the largest empire in the Western world, without a military campaign, without a scandal, without a purge, and had arrived at the end of it with the same composure he had brought to the beginning. The treasury was in surplus. The frontiers were quiet. The Senate had not been terrorized. Whatever came next, Antoninus had left it about as well as it could have been left. What came next was Marcus Aurelius. The Senate moved immediately to confirm Marcus as sole emperor. Marcus refused. He would not take the throne, he told them, unless Lucius Verus received equal powers, the full title of Augustus, the tribunician authority, all of it. The senators were surprised. Lucius was 31, had the reputation of a man who preferred parties to administration, had spent the long years of his apprenticeship rather differently from Marcus, and had nothing like Marcus's record of serious public service. The Senate had effectively offered Marcus the undivided power of Rome, and he had turned it down in order to honor arrangements made by dead men. And this was either a profound act of Stoic principle, honoring duty over preference, or a very shrewd political calculation that sharing the weight of empire with a co-emperor would be useful when the inevitable crises arrived. Almost certainly it was both at once. The crises arrived quickly. Within months of the accession, the Tiber flooded its banks and drove animals out of the lowlands. Carcasses rotted in the streets and left the city on the edge of famine. Across the water in the east, the Parthian king Vologases had watched the transfer of power in Rome with the attention of a man who understood that new emperors were sometimes distracted, and moved his army into Armenia, installing a Parthian candidate on the throne and displacing the Roman client king. A Roman legion that marched into Armenia to restore order was wiped out. the governor of Syria, sent his own force and suffered defeats. Within a year of Marcus taking the throne, the empire was fighting on its eastern frontier for the first time in a generation. The decision was made that Lucius should lead the Eastern campaign in person. The arguments were practical. Lucius was physically stronger, Marcus was unwell, and someone needed to stay in Rome because the city demanded an emperor's presence. Lucius was placed in nominal command, given a staff of capable generals, Statius Priscus, Avidius Cassius, Marcus Verus, and sent east to Antioch, which became his base. Antioch was also, conveniently, one of the more pleasant cities in the empire, with a lifestyle that suited Lucius considerably better than a frontier camp. He spent a great deal of time there and in the resort suburb of Daphne. Stoic and his critics reported that he diced through the night and kept a menagerie of entertainers. The actual fighting was done by the generals. They did it well. By 166, Rome had taken Ctesiphon, Armenia was secured, and the triumph was real, though the credit for winning it was slightly complicated by the question of who had been doing what. Marcus remained in Rome and worked. The administrative volume of the imperial office was enormous. Petitions arrived from every corner of the empire, from cities asking for exemptions, from individuals challenging inheritance decisions, from provincial governors requesting guidance on matters the law did not clearly resolve. Marcus answered them. Professional jurists of the period called him the most skilled emperor in the law within living memory. Not because he was a technical lawyer, but because he brought a seriousness of purpose to the legal function of his office that most emperors treated as a formality. He spent long hours in the hearing rooms, taking evidence, applying precedent, issuing decisions. He favored widows and orphans. He tightened the laws around the administration of estates to prevent fraud. He reduced the expense of gladiatorial shows, which he found distasteful and attended only when required. The gladiatorial games were one of the small, persistent discomforts of his position. The crowds loved them. The emperor was expected to be there, and his absence would have been noted and discussed in a way that a man managing the expectations of 1 million people could not afford. So Marcus went. He brought correspondence. He conducted meetings during the intervals. He found a way, by treating the spectacle as a meditation on the repetitive nature of human desire, different fighters, the same fundamental hunger, to make it philosophically useful. His tutors had spent years teaching him to mean what he said. He had learned instead to say what was required while meaning something else entirely, and the gap between those two modes of operation was something he found it necessary to note privately in his notes. He had written to himself, as a young man, that a man could live rightly even in a palace. He discovered that it was harder than it sounded. The court was the particular difficulty. Imperial Rome operated on a system of face, of public presentation, of appearing as what your position required rather than what you were. The emperor was surrounded by a staff whose job was to manage his image, his accessibility, his responses to the thousand small questions of precedent and protocol that governing a Mediterranean empire in the 2nd century generated daily. Marcus had been part of that apparatus for 23 years before he sat at its center. He knew how it worked. He also knew, with the particular clarity of a man who had spent decades examining his own tendency toward self-deception, that systems designed to manage the appearance of power had a strong tendency to replace the reality of power with something more comfortable and considerably less honest. He tried to compensate. He kept seeing philosophers. Sextus of Chaeronea, Plutarch's nephew, was still teaching in the later years of his reign, and Marcus went to his lectures even as emperor, sitting among the students, while taking the thing seriously enough to attract comment from contemporaries who found it unusual. The court around him had no particular use for philosophy. What it needed from him were decisions, signatures, appearances, speeches, and the visible performance of authority. The philosophy was his business, the thing he maintained in the space the court could not fill, the practice that was not performance. He kept the notes, he kept making them worse by his own standard, and returning the next morning to begin again. He was not healthy. Marcus Aurelius was never a robust man. As a child he had been serious rather than physical, and his commitment to philosophy had gradually displaced whatever athletic training his youth had included. He suffered from chronic chest and stomach complaints throughout his reign, pains he described in his correspondence with Fronto, sometimes in more clinical detail than the reader might have expected. Galen, the most famous physician of the age, treated him from at least 168 onward and left records suggesting a man whose constitution was fundamentally fragile, managing the demands of the most demanding job in the world on a body that would rather have been somewhere quieter. Marcus noted this in his meditations without self-pity. The body was not the point. What the body did or did not do was outside his control. What he did with the time and capacity it gave him was the only question worth asking. Lucius Verus died in 169. He and Marcus had been traveling north together to address the growing trouble on the Danube Frontier. The Germanic tribes that had been restless since the late 160s were now crossing the river in force, when Lucius had a stroke in a carriage. He was taken to the town of Altinum on the edge of the Venetian lagoon and died 3 days later. He was 38. Marcus organized the state funeral, arranged the deification, and absorbed the full weight of sole rule without a co-emperor for the first time in 8 years. He was 48. The plague had been running through the empire for 4 years. The northern frontier was now a war. There was no one to share it with, and no particular reason to expect it to end soon. What strikes anyone reading Marcus's letters and the administrative record of this period is the sheer volume of ordinary governance that continued through the extraordinary circumstances. Wars were fought at the frontier. In Rome, Marcus heard cases, issued edicts, adjusted legal precedents, managed the grain supply, responded to provincial governors' requests. Stoicism had no advice about frontier wars. It had very specific advice about maintaining equanimity while managing administrative volume under impossible pressure. And that turned out to be exactly what the job required. The man who had spent 20 years learning to hold his position in relation to the world, regardless of what the world was doing, had found his precise vocation. He did not enjoy it. He was very good at it. The first book of the Meditations ends with a line that locates where it was written. Among the Quadi at the Granua, a river in what is now Slovakia. It was written on campaign, north of the Danube, in the middle of the Germanic Wars, which means Marcus was writing his gratitude list, accounting his debts to his grandfather, his mother, his tutors, and the gods, while managing a military operation on a frontier that the empire had never quite controlled. The image of it is striking not because of the contrast between philosophy and war, but because it reveals the nature of what the Meditations actually are, not the productions of a man at leisure with his conscience, but the maintenance work of a man who could not afford to let his conscience lapse, because the day after he stopped maintaining it, it would cost someone else. Marcus had not wanted the throne. He had made that clear enough in what he wrote, if not in what he said publicly. He had noted in the Meditations that he should be careful not to turn into a Caesar, that the purple dye was something a person could drown in gradually. He had noted that the things that made imperial life comfortable, the court, the deference, the authority, were the same things that made it corrupt. And yet he had governed for 8 years, managed the plague's first wave, the Parthian War, the beginning of the Marcomannic crisis, the death of his co-emperor, and the daily administrative burden of 40 million people without a visible failure of the standard he was trying to meet. Not perfectly. He said so himself, in private. But consistently enough that Cassius Dio, writing decades later, he said that Marcus had not been given the good fortune he deserved, and that what was remarkable about him was not his success, but his refusal to stop, even when the world was doing everything it could to justify stopping. He was 50 years old, emperor for the 9th year, and the worst of what his reign would require was still ahead of him. The plague was not done. The wars were not done. The question of succession had not been answered. And on the Danube frontier, in a cold camp that smelled of wood smoke and horses, and the particular mud of a river valley in late autumn, Marcus Aurelius was still writing notes to himself about how to be a better man tomorrow than he had been today. He had every reason to have stopped believing it was possible. He had not stopped. In the winter of 165 AD, the Roman army was in Mesopotamia, or finishing a war. The campaign had gone well. Lucius Verus's generals had taken Seleucia on the Tigris, then pushed further to sack Ctesiphon, the Parthian capital, and burn the royal palace to the ground. The legions were victorious, laden with plunder, and moving back along the roads toward Rome. Somewhere in that march home, almost certainly among the troops who had been garrisoned in Seleucia, something else was moving too. The ancient accounts blamed the sack of a temple, a golden casket opened in the wrong moment, a divine punishment for sacrilege. The actual cause was biological. The soldiers were carrying a disease back from the east that the Roman world had never encountered before, and the Roman world had no immunity to what was coming. The first documented case of the sickness appeared in Smyrna in 165 A.D., and in the household of the orator Aelius Aristides, who nearly died from it. From the ports and trade routes of western Asia Minor, the disease moved west. It reached Rome in 166. By 172, it had touched every corner of the empire, from Egypt to Britain, from the Rhine frontier to the cities of North Africa. The physician Galen, who was in Rome when it arrived, described what he saw: high fever, inflammation of the throat, diarrhea, intense thirst, and on the 9th day of illness, a skin eruption, sometimes pustular, sometimes dry, that spread across the entire body. The eruptions turned black and dried, leaving behind deep scars on those who survived. Those who did not survive died within 2 weeks of the first fever. The mortality in cities was worst. In Rome, at the height of the outbreak, 2,000 people were dying every day. The city of Rome held more than 1 million people in a space that had been built for a fraction of that number, in apartment blocks that stacked 6 and 7 floors, where light and air were commodities, and clean water depended on an aqueduct system that could not reach every floor of every building. The conditions that had made Rome the greatest city in the world, its density, its connectivity, its constant flow of people from every province, were the same conditions that made it a near-perfect environment for a respiratory pathogen moving through a population with no prior exposure. The fires that burned the dead lit the city at night for weeks. The smell of smoke and incense filled the morning air as priests performed purification rites in public spaces where the gods had clearly stopped listening. Galen left Rome in 166 and went home to Asia Minor. He would later frame his departure as a response to divine instruction, which was possibly true and certainly convenient. He returned in 168 when Marcus and Lucius summoned him to Aquileia, where the plague had broken out again among troops assembling for the Marcomannic campaigns. Galen examined the sick soldiers and dictated his observations. He was the finest physician of his generation, the most systematic, the most rigorous, the most willing to follow observation to its conclusion rather than stopping at received theory. He could describe what the disease did to a body with remarkable precision. He could not explain what the disease was, where it came from at the cellular level, or how to stop it. No one could. There was nothing to be done except to treat the symptoms, isolate the sick, burn the dead, and wait. Marcus watched this from Rome and from the campaign roads. He had 13 children. Only 1 son and 4 daughters would outlive him, and most of those who died in childhood died during these years. The plague was not exclusively responsible for all those deaths. Childhood mortality in the ancient world was catastrophic by any standard, and Marcus's children were not spared from other causes, but the plague ran through his reign and through his household simultaneously, and the meditations of this period returned to death with an insistence that has a texture different from the philosophical acceptance of earlier entries. He had been trained to think about mortality since his teens, that he was now living inside it in the specific way that a man lives inside a catastrophe he did not choose and cannot end. The plague gutted the army. The legions that had returned from Parthia had carried the disease with them, and the cycle of transmission through the densely packed conditions of a Roman military camp was efficient and unforgiving. Entire units were reduced below fighting strength. The Danube Frontier, already a concern before the plague, was now being watched by a military establishment running significantly below the numbers it needed to hold the line. The Germanic tribes, the Marcomanni, the Quadi, the Iazyges, were moving with a confidence that had not been visible a decade earlier, and that confidence had a simple explanation. They could see that Rome was sick. Marcus did what the situation demanded and what Stoic philosophy did not make easier. He recruited gladiators into the legions. He recruited freed slaves. He recruited German auxiliaries, which meant bringing into the Roman military structure men who owed loyalty to their tribe first and to Rome second, and placing them along the frontier that was already under pressure. He also conducted a 2-month public auction at the Forum of Trajan, in which the contents of the imperial palace went under the hammer. Furniture from the imperial apartments, gold goblets, silver flagons, crystal vessels, Faustina's silk robes embroidered with gold, her jewelry, pieces from Hadrian's private collection that had been sitting in an inner room of the palace for 30 years. The auction raised money for the army. It also made a public statement about which things the emperor considered expendable in a crisis. The Stoics had spent decades telling him that material possessions were indifferent to his happiness. He tested the proposition at Trajan's Forum, and it held. The Germanic tribes broke through the Danube Frontier in 167 AD, the first time an invading force had penetrated into Italian territory in more than 2 centuries. The psychological shock to Rome was real and immediate. Senators fled to their country estates. The city, already managing plague deaths in the thousands daily, now processed the news that the frontier had been breached. Marcus did not flee. He stayed, addressed the crisis, continued the administrative machinery of the empire, and eventually, in 168, began moving north toward the Danube with Lucius to take personal command of the frontier response. It was on that march north that Lucius had his stroke and died. Marcus organized the funeral and turned around and went back to the campaign. What Marcus wrote in the Meditations during these years has no direct markers of the specific catastrophes around him. The notes do not say, "The plague is killing my soldiers," or "I have watched more children die than I can account to myself for." They say instead, "You have a brief time, use it. The things that seem terrible are indifferent. Even the greatest men are forgotten within a generation. Death is not to be feared, because it is simply the dissolution of the body back into the elements from which it was composed." The philosophy and the reality existed in a specific relationship, not the philosophy making the reality bearable exactly, but the philosophy being what remained when everything else had been taken. The one thing the plague and the frontier wars and the daily deaths could not reach, because it lived in the quality of his response rather than in any external circumstance. The famous contemporary description of the plague's devastation came from a writer who called it a beast that destroyed not just a few people, but rampaged across whole cities and destroyed them. Towns in Egypt, Gaul, and the Danubian provinces were left with populations so diminished that farms went uncultivated for lack of hands to work them. The tax base that funded the military and the bureaucracy contracted with the population. Local councils in cities across the empire could not meet because too many of their members were dead. Marcus responded by inviting migrants from beyond the imperial borders to settle on the abandoned farmland, an act of pragmatic openness that was also, in a quieter sense, an acknowledgement that Rome could not recover its population from within. The empire that emerged from the plague was physically smaller in its human dimension than the empire that had entered it. The plague ran for 15 years. It did not end cleanly. It receded in some places and returned in others, and a related outbreak in 189 AD, 9 years after Marcus died, killed 2,000 people a day in Rome at its worst. The total death toll across the full period has been estimated at between 5 and 10 million people. These are roughly 10% of the empire's entire population. Some regions lost significantly more. The army lost proportionally more still, given the conditions of camp life. This was not a disaster that arrived and departed. It was a condition of the world Marcus governed, present from 165 AD until his death and beyond, running beneath everything else like a second empire made entirely of death. Marcus Aurelius could not stop it. He did not have the tools, and the tools did not exist. Galen, the finest doctor in the empire, could describe the symptoms and keep the emperor alive and document the course of the disease through a patient's body with impressive precision. He could not explain the mechanism of contagion, could not identify the pathogen, could not develop anything that functioned as a treatment beyond rest, clean water, and the management of secondary infections. Marcus knew this. He knew it the way a man knows a thing he can neither change nor not think about, not through acceptance, because acceptance implies something was offered, but through a kind of practical acknowledgement that some problems are not within his control, and that the question was only ever what he could control. He could keep the administration running, he could keep the frontier defended, even with a diminished army. He could auction his own possessions to pay for it. He could not make 5 million people not die. There is a passage in the Meditations, undateable, like most of them, where Marcus observes that all the courts of the emperors before him, all the men who seemed to define the ages in which they lived, have dissolved into nothing. Hadrian, Antoninus, the philosophers and generals and administrators who seemed so permanent in their time, all gone, all dissolved back into the elements. He uses this not as an argument for despair, but as a tool for proportion. Whatever seems enormous right now is, in the long view, another passing thing. He wrote this during a plague that was killing 2,000 people a day in the city where he lived. The passage reads differently in that context than it reads as abstract philosophy in an annotated edition. It reads like a man using the longest available lens to look at a catastrophe he cannot stop, and finding in the length of that lens the only angle from which it becomes endurable. Stoicism had nothing to say about smallpox specifically. It had a great deal to say about the management of responses to catastrophes beyond a person's control, and about the distinction between what is within reach and what is not, about the daily requirement to do what duty demands, regardless of the external circumstances in which it must be done. Marcus had spent 20 years learning that framework before the plague arrived. When it came, when the army thinned and the cities emptied and the smoke of burning pyres filled the Roman sky, the framework was what he had. He did not write about the plague directly. He wrote about what he could control. He kept the notes. He kept the administration working. He kept going north, toward the frontier, toward the war that the plague had made significantly harder. In the Meditations, the closest he comes to the catastrophe is the frequency with which he returns to the fact of death, returning to it the way a man who has seen enough of a thing that he has decided, finally, that he is not afraid of it. Marcus Aurelius had never left Italy before the age of 49. He had spent his entire life within the radius of Rome, the Caelian Hill where he was born, the Palatine Hill where the emperors lived, the roads between Rome and the estates outside the city where the court retreated in summer. He had studied philosophy, managed petitions, sat in law courts, attended Senate sessions. He had watched men who knew armies tell him about armies. He had not commanded one, had not led one in the field, had not stood on ground that an enemy contested. When he finally did, it was because the ground was Italy. The enemy had crossed the Alps, and there was no one else. The Germanic tribes that broke through the Danube Frontier in 167 AD did so because the conditions had not been this favorable in a century. The plague had gutted the legions stationed along the river. The Parthian War had pulled experienced officers and men east for 5 years. The frontier, normally watched by Roman client kingdoms with a financial interest in stability, had been left with less oversight than usual and more restlessness than usual among the tribes pressing from beyond. The Marcomanni, led by a king named Balamar, assembled a coalition, Quadi, Iazyges, and a dozen smaller groups, and crossed the Danube in force. The Roman army at Carnuntum, the major fortress on the upper Danube in what is now Austria, lost 20,000 men in a single engagement. The Marcomanni kept moving south. They crossed the Alps. They besieged Aquileia. Aquileia was the gateway to Italy. It stood at the head of the Adriatic, the last major fortified point between the Danube and the rest of the peninsula. When its siege began, the news reached Rome with the particular character of news that people had stopped believing was possible. An external enemy had not reached Italian soil in more than 2 centuries. The senators who fled to their country estates were not cowards. They were people reacting to something that the empire had promised, since Augustus would not happen. Marcus did not flee. He stayed, addressed the crisis, and began the administrative process of moving north, which took longer than a man looking at a map would expect, because moving north meant raising, equipping, and organizing armies that the plague had left significantly below strength. He arrived at the Danube Frontier in the autumn of 169, after Lucius Verus was dead and the co-emperorship had dissolved back into sole rule. The camp at Carnuntum would be his base for most of the next decade. It was a legionary fortress of the standard type, a rectangular grid of stone buildings inside a defensive wall, organized around the headquarters in the center, the barracks in their rows, the granaries, the workshops, the hospital. The civilian city that had grown up beside it had a population of around 50,000, with its own forum, its amphitheater, its bathhouses, its market. By the standards of the empire's frontier, it was substantial. By the standards of Rome, it was the edge of the known world, and Marcus Aurelius, who had grown up looking at the Forum of Augustus from the Palatine Hill, now looked at the Danube from behind Carnuntum's walls and wrote notes to himself about impermanence. The irony of the Marcomannic Wars was that Marcus was better suited to them than the record would suggest. He had no military experience and no natural inclination toward campaigns. He found war philosophically repugnant. Stoicism said nothing good about killing men, and the Meditations contained passages that expressed genuine discomfort with the violence the frontier required. But he had spent 23 years learning to manage administrative complexity under pressure, and war turned out to be, among other things, a problem of administrative complexity under pressure. He organized supply lines across difficult terrain. He coordinated commanders across a multi-front conflict with the same attention to detail he had brought to the legal petitions of Rome. He endured the same winters, the same mud, the same cold that his soldiers endured, which they noticed and for which he was given a credit that surprised him. He crossed the Danube. That is the detail the Meditations preserve without comment. Book 1 closes with the phrase, among the Quadi, at the Granua being the Hron River, a Danube tributary in what is now Slovakia. The Hron runs on the enemy side of the frontier, north of the Danube itself. Marcus was not directing the war from Carnuntum. He was in barbarian territory, in the middle of the campaign, writing his gratitude list. The philosopher who had never wanted to leave Italy was writing about the debts he owed to his grandfather and his tutors from a position somewhere in the enemy's operational zone. The coexistence of these two facts, the gratitude list and the location, says something precise about what the Meditations actually are and where they were actually produced. The war went badly at first. 2 early engagements were Roman defeats, and the political and military pressure on Marcus, who critics were already calling a philosophical old woman who was too soft for frontier command, was considerable. He did not respond to the critics publicly. He responded to the situation by staying and by learning what he had not known at the beginning. By 171, the Romans had pushed the Marcomanni back across the Danube. By 172, they were operating north of the river, taking the war into Germanic territory. In 173, Marcus achieved one of his most decisive tactical results in a battle on the frozen Danube, surrounding and destroying a Quadi and Iazyges coalition that had trapped a Roman legion on the ice. The Roman soldiers formed a defensive square, shields locked. Marcus was in the cavalry at the center. The Quadi's horses, trained for ice, could not break the formation. They were destroyed at close range by men who were better organized under pressure than men who had been fighting longer. The campaign continued. The Meditations were being written in the camps, at Carnuntum, at Sirmium, on the Sar, in the field. In the east, Book 3 opens with a heading, Written at Carnuntum. There is something extraordinary about the geography of the document that is now sold in airport bookshops. The chapter that begins, You could leave life right now, was written in a military camp on the Danube frontier during a decade-long war. The chapter that returns, again, to the transience of all things was written by a man who could hear the Danube from his tent. The abstractness of the philosophy is not, in this context, an evasion of the reality around it. It is the tool Marcus was using to remain functional inside that reality. Without the philosophy, he would have been a man sitting in a military camp in the mud with a war he did not want, and a plague that would not stop, and a decade of it still ahead of him. With the philosophy, he was the same man, but one with a method for continuing. The physical cost of the wars was specific and not hidden. Marcus's health, never robust, deteriorated significantly during the frontier years. Galen, who remained in attendance, treated a body that was running on inadequate sleep, difficult food, and chronic exposure to the cold and damp of a Danubian winter. Marcus had been a slight man, never athletic, and the constitution that had served him adequately in the palaces of Rome was working considerably harder in the legionary camps of Pannonia. He noted in the Meditations, without self-pity, but with a precision that suggests personal experience, that there was nothing to be done about the body's condition except to manage what could be managed and stop thinking about the rest. The body was outside his control. What he did on any given day, within whatever the body allowed, was the only question. He had planned, when the wars wound toward resolution in the mid-70s, to finish the job permanently. The peace terms he imposed in 175 were strict. The tribes were forbidden to enter a wide buffer zone along the Danube, required to provide hostages and military levies, prohibited from holding markets except at specified times under Roman supervision. He had also conceived a more ambitious solution, the annexation of the Marcomannic and Quadi territories north of the Danube as two new provinces, Marcomannia and Sarmatia, which would push the imperial frontier back to the Sudetes and the Carpathian Arc and end the structural instability that had produced the wars. It was not a conservative idea. It was the most expansionist Roman strategic concept since Trajan. Marcus had been working toward its implementation when the revolt of Avidius Cassius erupted in the east and pulled him back. He returned to the Danube in 177 after settling the eastern crisis, with Commodus beside him now, the boy he had declared Augustus 2 years earlier, the son he was preparing for what came next. The second phase of the wars ran until Marcus died. He did not abandon the plan for the new provinces. He was still working toward it in 180, spending the winter at Vindobona, the legionary camp at what is now Vienna, still pressing the campaign, still maintaining the administrative volume of an empire that did not pause for war, still writing, probably, though no notes from the final years have been conclusively identified. He died in March 180 in a camp on the Danube, need of causes that almost certainly included the plague that had run through his reign since 165. Commodus ended the wars within months of taking sole power. He accepted terms that Marcus would not have accepted. The buffer zone requirements dropped, the troop levies reduced, the new province plan abandoned entirely. From Rome's perspective, the gains of 15 years of frontier warfare evaporated quickly into a peace that restored the situation to roughly what it had been before the wars began. The tribes retained their political structures and their military capacity, and the long Danube line that had been Rome's most persistent structural problem remained Rome's most persistent structural problem. The historian Cassius Dio, who lived through the Severan era and looked back at this period, described Marcus's reign as a kingdom of gold that was then followed by an age of iron and rust. He placed the transition at the death of Marcus, not at any particular battle or treaty. There is a philosophical dimension to the wars that the Meditations reveal indirectly. Marcus had spent his adult life absorbing a framework that said, "Do your duty, regardless of the conditions. The thing that is within your control is the quality of your own response. Everything else is outside it." The wars tested that framework over 15 years of specific material difficulty. Cold winters, dead soldiers, inadequate supply, defeats, the knowledge that his body was failing, the awareness that the plan he had for the frontier might not outlast him. He kept the notes, he kept returning to the same ideas, he kept going north. But there is something in the Meditations that only makes sense in the context of the camps, a quality of stubbornness that is distinct from the Stoic ideal of serene acceptance. Marcus was not serene. He was determined. Those are different states, and the difference is what makes the Meditations something more interesting than a philosophical treatise. Cassius Dio said of Marcus that he was not given the good fortune he deserved, and that he spent his reign involved in a multitude of troubles throughout almost his entire time in power. What Dio admired was not that Marcus had found peace in the philosophy, but that he had survived the reign without it destroying him and had kept the empire functioning at the same time. The philosopher, who had never wanted to leave Italy, never did return to it. Not really. He spent the last decade of his life in a succession of military camps along the Danube, writing to himself about impermanence from the one place that demonstrated it most clearly, and going back to the war each morning because there was nothing else he could honestly do. In the spring of 175 A.D., the Marcomannic Wars were finally approaching resolution. The Yazyges had sued for peace. The Quadi and the Marcomanni, after 6 years of costly campaigning, were at the point of submission. Marcus was on the verge of implementing the most ambitious frontier policy Rome had attempted in a generation: the annexation of Germanic territory north of the Danube, the creation of 2 new provinces, an end to the structural problem that had produced the wars in the first place. It was the closest he had come in 14 years of reign to something that might have been called a clean result. Then a courier arrived from the east. Avidius Cassius had declared himself emperor. He was the governor of Syria, the supreme commander of Rome's eastern forces, the most experienced military officer Marcus had, the man who had effectively won the Parthian War while Lucius spent the campaign in Antioch's resort suburbs. He was known for severity. Soldiers he judged incompetent met ruthless mass executions. Deserters faced the most severe and fatal imperial punishments. He had called Marcus, in private correspondence that was never meant to be seen, a philosophical old woman who let men live whose lives he did not approve of. What had given him the confidence to move was a false report, a rumor, probably originating somewhere in the chaos of a military camp, that Marcus Aurelius had died of his illness on the Danube. Cassius had acted on that rumor and then found, when it was too late to retreat, that the man he thought dead was very much alive and assembling an army to deal with him. The revolt controlled Egypt, Syria, and Arabia, 7 legions, and, critically, the grain supply that fed Rome. The prefect of Egypt had issued an edict recognizing the new emperor. Rome, hundreds of miles from the nearest threat, panicked anyway. Marcus had to send troops to the city to calm the streets. The Senate, moving faster than usual, declared Cassius a public enemy. Herod Atticus, philosopher, former teacher of Marcus, by then an old man, sent Cassius a letter that consisted of a single word: "Amains." You're mad. Yet it was the most economical political commentary of the reign. Marcus did not immediately tell his soldiers. He kept the news contained while he considered it, not because he was indecisive, but because he understood what the knowledge would do to men who had been fighting for 6 years on the Danube and who would hear this as a signal for rage and revenge. When he finally addressed them, the speech he gave was unlike anything a Roman emperor in his position would have been expected to say. He told them that if the threat were to him personally, he would willingly put the matter before the Senate and the legions and let them choose between himself and Cassius. He told them he hoped Cassius would not meet a desperate end by his own volition or fall to an assassin, because the greatest prize available to him in this situation was not military victory over a rebel. It was something else entirely: to forgive a man who had wronged him, to remain a friend to someone who had broken faith, to show that there was a right way to handle even civil wars. This was not what emperors said. Roman precedent for dealing with a usurper was clear and had been observed since the Republic. Suppress the revolt, execute the ringleaders, make examples of the principal supporters to deter future attempts. Forgiving a rival was an invitation to the next one. The senators who would later argue for death sentences for Cassius's supporters were not being unreasonably vindictive. They were following the logic of political survival as Roman history had established it. Marcus was doing something else, something that his Stoic framework demanded of him, but that the political reality of an empire made genuinely costly. He was treating the revolt as an occasion for demonstrating a principle rather than establishing a deterrent. Cassius held Egypt for 3 months. Then, his own centurion killed him. The centurion sent the fallen rebel's remains to Marcus, who refused to look at the macabre prize and had it buried. He had wanted to pardon the man in person, and the opportunity was now gone. He had lost the one thing he had specifically said he wanted from the whole episode. Marcus continued east anyway. He had already been planning a tour of the eastern provinces, which had not seen an emperor in person for years, and the crisis had made the visit more urgent, not less. He arrived in a region still absorbing the shock of having backed the wrong emperor, and found that his popularity had, remarkably, increased. The provinces that had risen against him responded to his clemency with relief that outran any political calculation, because they had expected the usual response and been given a different one. The question of what had moved Cassius to act is not entirely clear, and the most uncomfortable version involves Faustina. Several ancient accounts, including Cassius Dio, suggest that the empress, knowing Marcus was gravely ill and fearing that his death with Commodus still a teenager would produce a contested succession, had been in contact with Cassius. The arrangement, as reconstructed from rumor and the available fragments, was that Cassius would guarantee stability in the east and offer Faustina a political anchor for her son's eventual succession. When the false news of Marcus's death arrived, Cassius moved on the strength of an understanding that had not been meant to be acted on yet. Faustina died in late 175 or early 176 in a village in Cappadocia while traveling east with Marcus. Cassius Dio was not certain whether she died of illness or orchestrated her own tragic demise before her possible role in the revolt could be fully examined. Marcus deified her, named the village Faustinopolis in her honor, and established a school for orphaned girls in her memory. He said nothing publicly about the rumors. He had ordered Cassius's correspondence burned before he arrived in Syria. This was an act with two possible readings. Either he was destroying evidence of a conspiracy he did not want to pursue, or he was eliminating the temptation to seek revenge for things that would only make him angry without being actionable. Both readings are probably true simultaneously. He would later swear before the Capitol, on his return to Rome, that no senator had been executed in his reign with his knowledge or consent, a public declaration of an intention he had been sustaining for 14 years that was now even harder to maintain, given that senators had openly backed a rebel. The difficulty of maintaining it was precisely why he declared it publicly. He was holding himself to the standard by making it impossible to quietly abandon. When he arrived in the East, he was received not as a conqueror, but as an emperor who had chosen mercy in circumstances that made mercy costly. The city of Antioch, which had been a center of support for Cassius and had said things about Marcus that he was told about but refused to read in detail, expected punishment. He withheld it initially, removing their games and certain civic distinctions, and then restored them. He declined to prosecute the senators who had backed the revolt, sending those who needed to be tried before the Senate rather than his own court, setting a date for their hearing and writing to that body with a specific request that no senator should be put to death as a consequence of this affair, that his reign should pass without the blood of a senator on his record. The Senate senators who wanted executions were frustrated. The historical record notes that some executions happened anyway, at the level of military centurions, before Marcus could stop them. He grieved these specifically. The political cost of the pardon was real and was noted by contemporaries who understood Roman political logic better than Marcus's Stoic framework required him to. By declining to punish severely, he signaled to the next potential usurper that the penalty for failure was survivable. The senators who argued for executions were not wrong about this. Marcus was trading future security for present principle, and he probably knew it. What the Meditations suggest, and this is inference since the notes are undatable, is that he had spent 20 years preparing himself for a version of power that did not require making that trade. The philosophy said, act well, regardless of consequences, because the quality of the action is the only thing within your control. The political reality said, consequences matter enormously when 40 million people's stability depends on the deterrent your response provides. Marcus chose the philosophy. He did so knowing the political reading was not wrong. He returned to Rome in late 176 and celebrated a triumph for the Marcomannic victories, with Commodus walking beside him. He declared Commodus Augustus, not co-emperor in the full sense yet, but elevated, and then spent time trying to consolidate what the wars had achieved before they required him again. The frontier plan for the new provinces had been suspended during the Cassius crisis. He intended to return to it. Senators and advisors had been telling him, since at least 173, that the northern frontier was largely pacified and that he could return to Rome permanently. He had consistently refused on the grounds that the campaign was not finished, and he was right. Within a year, the Marcomanni had moved again, the Quadi had violated their treaty, and Marcus was heading back to the Danube. What the Cassius Revolt revealed, among other things, was the specific political cost of Marcus's philosophy and practice. Stoicism gave him a framework for responding to betrayal with equanimity and mercy. It did not give him a framework for managing the political consequences of equanimity and mercy at the level of an empire. The two things were not incompatible. An emperor could be stoic and effective, but the revolt of Avidius Cassius was the moment when the gap between them became most visible. When the philosophy required him to do something that the political situation recommended against, and when he chose the philosophy anyway and let the political cost fall where it would. He had written in the Meditations that a man who has wronged you shares your nature and deserves your consideration. Cassius had called him a philosophical old woman for believing it. Marcus believed it anyway. There is a version of this story where Marcus's clemency was a calculated political masterstroke, that pardoning a revolt was smarter than executing its supporters because it created more goodwill than fear could. This version is probably partly true. Clemency that creates relief is politically useful. But reading the Meditations alongside the political record, and seeing the consistency with which Marcus returned to the same principles under pressure, it is difficult to sustain the reading that the clemency was purely strategic. He wanted to forgive Cassius in person. He grieved when Cassius was killed before he could. He wrote to the Senate, begging them not to execute the rebel supporters. A purely strategic actor does not grieve lost opportunities for clemency. A man who believes what the Meditations say does. The revolt of Avidius Cassius was resolved. The new provinces were not. Commodus was now Augustus. Faustina was dead. Marcus was 54 years old, still in poor health, still heading back to the Danube. He had managed a near-civil war with a severity of clemency that shocked his contemporaries and would be praised by later historians who never had to govern anything. The Senate had wanted blood. The Stoic philosophy had wanted forgiveness. The emperor had sided with the philosophy and the empire had not collapsed, which was perhaps the most anyone could have said. He went back to the frontier anyway, because the frontier was still there. And going back was what duty required, and he had spent his life being unable to do anything other than what duty required. It was the only thing in the whole catastrophic situation that had ever been within his control. Carnuntum sat on the south bank of the Danube in what is now eastern Austria, about 40 kilometers east of modern Vienna. The river there is wide and fast, moving through flat country toward the Hungarian plain, and in winter, the air off the water carries a cold that finds every gap in clothing and settles in the joints. The fortress that marked the site had been there since Tiberius, expanded and rebuilt across the decades, until it held a full legion, around 5,000 men, inside walls of stone, with the civilian city that had grown up beside it, bringing the total population to roughly 50,000. It was the largest Roman presence on the Middle Danube, the capital of the province of Upper Pannonia, and for most of the 170s AD it was where Marcus Aurelius lived. He had been 50 years old when he arrived at the frontier to take personal command. He was in his late 50s when the wars wound toward their resolution. The decade between those 2 points was spent largely in a succession of camps and fortified positions along the river, Carnuntum, Aquincum to the east, modern Budapest. Sirmium further still, moving with the campaigns as the fighting required, returning to base for the administration that could not stop simply because the emperor was at war. He endured the same winters as his soldiers. The ancient accounts note this specifically because it was unusual, because emperors were not generally expected to share the cold and the mud and the inadequate rations of a Danubian winter campaign. His soldiers noticed and gave him a credit that Marcus, who had spent 2 decades learning to be suspicious of praise, recorded nowhere but probably felt. The physical conditions of the frontier were the specific opposite of everything Marcus had grown up in. Rome was stone and marble, and the smell of the bakeries near the Forum. The frontier was timber palisades and the smell of the river, horses, wood smoke, wet, and the particular cold mud that forms when an army camps in the same place through winter. He slept in the quarters of the legionary fortress, a stone building, but austere by imperial standards, without the accumulated generations of art and furniture and household arrangements that characterized life on the Palatine. He noted this in the Meditations without complaint, in the context of a general observation about the transience of comfort. The point was not to be uncomfortable, but to understand that comfort was indifferent to his well-being in the Stoic sense, which meant it was also indifferent to his purpose. He was there to do a specific thing. The conditions in which he did it were outside his control. The doing of it was not. Across the river, north of the Danube, were the people he was fighting. The Marcomanni occupied what is now Bohemia. The Quadi held the territory further east. The Yazyges, a Sarmatian people, controlled the steppe between the Danube and the Carpathians. None of them were the uniform barbarian horde of Roman propaganda. They had kings, treaties, diplomatic histories with Rome going back generations, and a sophisticated understanding of the frontier as a zone of negotiation, as much as conflict. They also had cavalry, numerical superiority in their own territory, and the capacity to absorb losses and continue fighting that had worn down the Roman military effort repeatedly over 6 years before Marcus arrived. They had watched the plague gut the Roman army and the plague-weakened army fail to hold the river. The confidence with which they had crossed in 167 was not irrational. Not Marcus crossed the Danube himself. The Meditations record it without comment in the geographical heading of Book 1, among the Quadi at the Granua. But the Granua is the Hron River, and the Hron runs on the north bank, in territory that was not Roman, among people who were actively hostile. He was not directing the war from behind the fortress wall. He was in the field, in the enemy's operational zone, writing his gratitude list. The image has something absurd about it only if you treat the philosophy and the war as belonging to different categories. Marcus did not. The philosophy was what made the war survivable as a daily experience. The notes were the maintenance required to keep the philosophy functional under conditions designed to erode it. There is a passage in Book 5 of the Meditations, undatable, but almost certainly from the frontier period given its texture, where Marcus argues with himself about getting out of bed. He tells himself that it is his job to get up, that getting up is what a human being does when there is work to do, that nature has set a limit on sleep just as it sets a limit on eating, and that he is over the limit on sleep and not yet at the limit on work. The passage is famous now, extracted and posted on productivity websites and self-improvement accounts. In the context of a military camp on the Danube in winter, with the plague still running through the provinces and another day of campaign administration ahead, it has a different weight. It is not a man giving himself permission to be ambitious. It is a man who is physically and constitutionally exhausted, giving himself a reason, one more time, to put his feet on the floor. Galen was treating him. The most famous physician of the age had been attending Marcus since at least 168, managing the chest and stomach complaints that had plagued him since childhood, and that the conditions of a frontier campaign were doing nothing to improve. Galen noted that Marcus took theriac, a complex medicinal compound that emperors had used as a general treatment since Nero, on a daily basis, and that he could not eat without it. The exact composition of theriac in Marcus's time included opium, which has led some later historians to speculate about addiction. Galen himself seems to have managed the dosage carefully, at one point reducing it to try to understand what the underlying condition actually was. What is clear from the Galenic accounts is that Marcus was not well and had not been well for years, and that the work continued regardless. He was writing the Meditations in these conditions. Book 3 opens, written at Carnuntum. The note places one of the most read philosophical texts in Western history at a legionary fortress in Austria during a decade-long frontier war. The specific entry that follows addresses the failure of mental capacity, the fear that before the body dies, the mind will already have begun to lose its precision, its ability to examine things accurately, to know them for what they are. He writes that the early symptoms of this failure are not physical but mental, not digestion, not sensation, but the higher functions, the capacity for genuine philosophical inquiry. He was noting this in Carnuntum, Dio in his 50s, with a failing body and an active war, and what he feared was not death, but the erosion of the tool that made the work worth doing. The column of Marcus Aurelius still stands in Rome, in the Piazza Colonna, a marble spiral of carved reliefs that runs from the base to the top, recording scenes from the Marcomannic Wars. It was completed after his death, probably under Commodus, and the scenes on it, Romans crossing the Danube on pontoon bridges, cavalry engagements on the northern plain, the emperor addressing his troops, Germanic villages burning, represent the official version of what those years had been. The column is propaganda, as all such monuments are. What the Meditations preserve is something different, the private version, the version that contains the passage about not wanting to get out of bed, and the passage about the degradation of the mind and the repeated returns to the same handful of ideas that kept a man functional in conditions that would have justified stopping. The frontier changed him in ways that Rome had not. He had governed an empire from a palace for 8 years without leaving Italy, and the governing had been difficult and consequential, but it had a texture of remove. The petitions, the legal decisions, the Senate sessions, the ceremonies, all carried out at a distance from the specific physical reality of what he was governing. The frontier put him inside the physical reality. He saw what Roman soldiers ate and where they slept and what the cold did to a body that had been marching since September. He saw a combat, probably not closely, but close enough to produce the passage in the Meditations where he notes, with a clinical detachment that reads as the product of having actually seen it, what the gruesome toll of the battlefield looks like when soldiers are broken by the machinery of war, and how this is, philosophically, just the natural extension of other kinds of separation. It is a very specific observation for a man who had grown up in gardens. The administrative work continued. This is the aspect of Marcus's frontier years that receives the least attention and constitutes the most significant practical achievement. An empire of 40 million people cannot pause for a frontier war. Petitions arrived at the camp. Legal disputes required decisions. Governors needed direction. Tax assessments had to be reviewed. The treaties had to be negotiated simultaneously with fighting. The administrative record of the 170s shows Marcus managing the governance of the empire from a series of military camps with essentially the same thoroughness that he had applied to it from Rome, adjusting legal precedents, responding to provincial inquiries, hearing cases on days when the fighting permitted it. The frontier gave him a very specific and demanding context in which to discover what his 23-year preparation for the throne had actually built. It had built a man who could do the job under these conditions. That is, in the end, a more significant accomplishment than any single military victory. His critics in Rome, there were critics, there always are, argued during the frontier years that the emperor should come home. True that the provincial governors and generals could manage the campaign without the emperor's personal presence, that the comfort and safety of the capital were appropriate to a man of his position and age. Marcus received these representations and ignored them. He had noted in the Meditations that he should be wary of abusing court life in front of company, meaning he had done it, complained about the palace and its demands in ways he later judged unworthy. But the alternative, returning to the palace from a war that was not finished, was something he seems never to have seriously considered. He had been telling himself since his 20s that a man could live rightly in a palace. He had apparently also concluded that a man could die on the Danube rather than abandon what the Danube required. Nor he spent the second period of the frontier wars, after the Cassius Revolt, from 177 to his death, with Commodus beside him, The boy who would become the catastrophe was learning war from his father, who had never wanted to learn war himself. Marcus made Commodus Augustus in 177, elevated to co-emperor, the succession made unambiguous. He was being trained, as Marcus had been trained, by exposure and experience rather than by classroom instruction. The difference was that Marcus had spent 23 years in preparation before the throne, while Commodus was 16 when he was elevated and 19 when his father died. What a Danube campaign taught a boy whose father had been too busy fighting to be present for most of his childhood is a question the historical record cannot fully answer. But the Meditations give some indication of what Marcus hoped to convey, that duty was not negotiable, that the right action was the right action regardless of comfort or circumstance, that the quality of a man's response to his life was the only thing in it that he genuinely owned. The strenuous weariness that Gilbert Murray, writing in the 19th century, identified in the Meditations, the mood of a man doing his duty as a good soldier, waiting for the trumpet that would signal retreat, has its geography here, on the banks of the Danube, in winter camp. Marcus Aurelius did not find the frontier years fulfilling in the way that a man finds fulfilling the work he was born to do. He found them necessary. That is a different quality of engagement, and the Meditations record it honestly. Not a man who has found his purpose in war, but a man who has found that purpose is not the same as preference, and that doing what is necessary without it being what you wanted is, in Stoic terms, exactly the work that virtue is made of. The river ran cold and fast behind the fortress wall. He had been there for years. He went back to the notes. Every treatment of Marcus Aurelius arrives eventually at the same point and runs into the same problem. The man who wrote about wisdom and governance with more honesty than almost any other figure in ancient history made, by conventional assessment, the most consequential mistake of his reign with his eyes open. He named Commodus his heir. He elevated a boy whose character Galen, his own physician, had expressed doubts about, but whose early behavior had reportedly included condemning a servant to a horrific death because his bathwater was not warm enough, and whose interests ran entirely toward the arena and the pleasures of a court that his father had spent a lifetime criticizing. He named this boy Augustus in 177 and watched him govern for 3 years at his side before dying and leaving him the world. What he saw in those 3 years, we don't know. What he left behind is on the record. The standard explanation, that Marcus loved Commodus and was blind to his faults, is the explanation that requires the least engagement with the man who produced the Meditations. The Meditations are the private record of a man who examined himself and everyone around him with forensic honesty. A man who wrote that he woke every morning preparing to meet the ungrateful, or the envious and the treacherous. A man who noted specifically that good fortune is not the same as good character, and that the things we call honors, titles, office, hereditary prestige, are worth nothing in Stoic terms without the virtue to use them. This man was not blind to Commodus. The more uncomfortable reading is that he saw clearly and chose anyway, and that the choice had reasons that the Stoic framework he had spent a lifetime developing did not entirely endorse. The first reason was structural and political. The 5 emperors before Marcus who had produced the remarkable century of stability he inherited, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, had all selected successors by adoption, choosing men of proven competence from the available pool of Roman aristocracy and grooming them for the role. This is remembered as a system of merit. It was also a system of necessity. None of those emperors had a biological son who survived to manhood. When Trajan adopted Hadrian, it was because he had no son. When Hadrian arranged the succession through Antoninus, it was because he had no son. The adoptive succession that created the 5 good emperors was not primarily a philosophical choice. It was what emperors without sons did. Marcus Aurelius was the first emperor in nearly a century to have a biological son who survived to adulthood. An emperor who bypassed his biological son to adopt a more qualified successor would have been doing something historically unusual in Rome, and the political consequences would have been immediate. Commodus, passed over in favor of an adoptive heir, would have become a rival. And rivals in the Roman imperial system were resolved with remarkable consistency. The moment Marcus chose an adopted successor, he would have been creating the conditions for his son's murder. As one later observer put it plainly, the first job of any new emperor would have been to eliminate Commodus, because leaving a blood claimant alive was an invitation to the next civil war. Marcus could not choose Commodus's safety and Rome's quality emperor simultaneously. He chose the one that meant his son stayed alive. But the safety argument, while real, does not fully account for the decision. An emperor of Marcus Aurelius's intellectual resources, who had spent 20 years preparing for power and 15 years exercising it, had other options. But he could have arranged an interim solution, a capable senior general as co-emperor who would govern effectively while Commodus matured and was trained to the role, with the expectation that Commodus would succeed the interim figure. There is some evidence that Marcus considered Tiberius Claudius Pompeianus, his most trusted general and son-in-law, for exactly this kind of interim role. Pompeianus reportedly refused, or at least expressed significant reluctance, on the grounds that the people of Rome would not accept him as a legitimate ruler. The option existed. It did not happen. The Cassius Revolt of 175 changed the calculation in a way that is rarely given its due weight. The rumor that had triggered Cassius's declaration was the rumor that Marcus was dead. The empire had come within a few months of a succession crisis with Commodus still a teenager, and Faustina's apparent involvement in the Cassius scheme suggested that even Marcus's own household understood how precarious the situation was. The revolt's lesson, that an empire without a clear established adult heir was dangerously unstable, was exactly the lesson that pushed Marcus toward accelerating Commodus's elevation. In 176, the year after the revolt was suppressed, he made Commodus Augustus. He was 15. The acceleration was not driven by confidence in the boy's character. It was driven by the specific lesson of what had happened when the empire thought the emperor was dead. There's a third reading that sits inside the other two and is the most difficult to dismiss in the light of the Meditations. Marcus Aurelius knew what Commodus was, chose dynasty over merit anyway, and lived with the knowledge of what that choice meant. Stoicism had many things to say about duty, about the common good, about the obligation to act for the benefit of more people than oneself. It had nothing comfortable to say about a man who deliberately chose the lesser outcome for the empire in order to protect his son. Marcus had spent years writing that the things we call goods, wealth, comfort, safety, the survival of our children, are indifferent in the Stoic sense, that they do not constitute genuine good, that genuine good is only virtue and the right action taken, regardless of personal consequence. And then he chose to protect his son. The Meditations contain a passage, undateable, like most of them, where Marcus reminds himself to be wary of turning into a Caesar, of being dipped in the purple dye and forgetting what he had been before it. He had been warning himself against the seductions of power for decades. The decision about Commodus suggests that the seduction he most needed to guard against was not the obvious one, personal aggrandizement, the abuses of an absolute ruler, but the domestic one, the one that dressed itself as love and duty and the natural impulse of a father toward his son. Stoicism had no easy answer for that. The Meditations have no entry that says, "I have chosen Commodus, I know what this means, I've made peace with the knowledge." What they have is the record of a man who kept returning to the same questions about duty and virtue and the common good, and who did not always answer them the way the philosophy demanded. Commodus was made Augustus in the summer of 177. He was 16. He was then brought to the Danube and placed alongside his father for the second phase of the Marcomannic Wars, learning war in the way Marcus had learned everything, by being present and watching. What the boy made of the Danube frontier, of the cold and the mud and the administrative machinery of a campaign, is recorded nowhere in detail. What the ancient sources preserve from this period is his interest in gladiatorial combat, his tendency to spend time with people of low character, not his indifference to the intellectual and administrative activities that had consumed his father's life. He was not stupid. He was not incompetent in the basic functions of showing up and performing the ceremonial role. He was something more specific and more difficult, a man for whom the things his father valued were simply not interesting. Marcus died in March 180 at Vindobona, still on the Danube frontier, with Commodus at his side. Commodus took the necessary decisions within days. He ended the Marcomannic Wars on terms his father would not have accepted, abandoned the plan for the new provinces north of the Danube, and returned to Rome to celebrate a triumph. He was 19. He was Rome. The general who had been directing the campaign, Pertinax, noted that the war had been all but won. Yeah, that a few more months would have achieved the result Marcus had been working toward for 14 years. Commodus was not interested in a few more months. He had other things to do in Rome. Within 2 years, his sister Lucilla was conspiring to assassinate him. Within 5, senators were being executed. Within a decade, he had renamed Rome after himself, declared himself Hercules Romanus, and was fighting staged gladiatorial bouts in the Colosseum with opponents who were sometimes disabled men tied together and sometimes professional gladiators with blunted weapons who were expected to fall at the right moment. He charged 1 million sesterces from the gladiatorial fund for each appearance in the arena. He renamed the months of the year after his own titles. When he was finally killed in 192, assassinated in his bath by a wrestling partner who had been recruited for the purpose, Rome entered the chaos of the year of the 5 emperors and did not fully stabilize for another century. The standard historical verdict on the Commodus Decision is that Marcus loved his son, was blinded by that love, and failed the empire he had spent 19 years serving. This verdict sits uncomfortably against the record of a man who was almost never blinded by affection and almost never avoided uncomfortable truths in his private writing. The alternative verdict, that Marcus knew, weighed the options, and chose dynastic stability over imperial quality, like making a calculated political decision that he understood would produce a worse emperor, sits uncomfortably against the Stoic framework that said the common good should always take precedence over personal attachment. Neither verdict is satisfying, which is probably the point. The decision was not satisfying. It was what the man could bring himself to do, which is different from what the philosophy demanded, and Marcus Aurelius was honest enough with himself to understand the difference. Gibbon, writing in the 18th century, identified the death of Marcus Aurelius as the precise moment when Rome began its long descent. Cassius Dio, who lived through the Severan era and looked back at Commodus from first-hand experience, described the transition as a fall from a kingdom of gold to one of iron and rust. The image has a rhetorical quality. History does not change in a single moment. Empires do not fall in a day, but the diagnosis has a specific accuracy. What Commodus ended was not a decade of good government, but a system. The system in which the emperor's personal quality was the foundation of the empire's function. Rome had no constitutional mechanism for removing a bad emperor. When the emperor was good, the empire worked. When the emperor was not, it did not. Marcus had understood this better than almost any man alive. He had also understood it 20 years too late to design a different system and too close to the edge of his own death to find a better answer. The Meditations were written by a man who believed with more conviction than most people ever achieve about anything. That virtue was the only genuine good, and that every other consideration was indifferent. He also chose his son. Those two facts coexist in the record of Marcus Aurelius without resolution. And the absence of resolution is, finally, the most honest thing about him. He was not a success story. He was a man who tried, with enormous sincerity and considerable skill, to hold a philosophy and an empire at the same time, and who discovered at the end that the empire won, not through corruption or self-indulgence or the obvious failures of power, through something quieter and harder to defend against, the ordinary love of a father for his child, and the weight it carried against every principle he had spent a lifetime building. The popular image of Marcus Aurelius is of a man who found philosophy, applied it to his life, and became its most famous demonstration. The philosopher king made flesh, proof that wisdom and power can coexist without either corrupting the other. The Meditations are read as the record of that success, 12 books of achieved wisdom, passed down to a world that needs them. This reading is understandable and almost entirely wrong. The Meditations are not the record of wisdom achieved. They are the record of a man who kept failing to achieve his own standard and kept returning to the attempt every morning across a decade and more of catastrophic historical circumstances. Every entry is evidence of the preceding day. And the preceding day, almost every time, had not been enough. He had noted early that he should be wary of abusing court life in front of company. The note exists because he had done it, complained about the palace and the ceremony and the performances of imperial public life in front of people who were watching his every expression for something they could use or sell. The Stoic knew that complaining was a form of self-indulgence. The man had complained anyway. He returned to the standard because the departure from it was real, not hypothetical. This is the texture of the Meditations throughout, not a philosopher describing what virtue looks like from the outside, but a practitioner noting what it looks like when it fails and what is required to resume it. Anger was one of his specific problems, documented in his own writing with a consistency that confirms it was not occasional. He warned himself about anger repeatedly, to restrain it, to see the person who provoked it as a relative of his own nature, sharing the same rational capacity, to understand that responding with anger was always a failure of reason. He also noted, thanking the gods in Book 1's gratitude list, that he had never gone too far in acting on his anger at Rusticus, his teacher, which implies he had felt it often enough that not acting on it required specific effort over many years. The repetition of the anger passages in the Meditations is not rhetorical. A man who had conquered anger does not need to address it in book after book. A man who is still managing it does. The management of other people's incompetence and malice was another recurring theme. At the opening of Book 2, he tells himself to expect each morning to meet the meddling, the ungrateful, the arrogant, the deceitful, the envious, the unsocial, and to remember that they share his nature, that none of them can harm him in the only sense that genuinely matters, that anger at them is pointless because they act from ignorance. He returned to this preparation regularly enough that it had become a daily ritual. What the regularity reveals is not the serenity of a man who had mastered patience with difficult people. It is the evidence of a man surrounded by difficult people, the court, the campaign staff, the Senate, the provincial governors sending self-serving dispatches, who needed the reminder every morning, because every morning he was going to need it again. The court itself wore on him in specific ways that the Meditations make visible. He had told himself that a man could live rightly in a palace, noted that the quality of his own choices did not depend on his surroundings. He also noted that the things the court valued, flattery, display, the theater of power, were the opposite of what the philosophy required, and that the constant proximity to flattery created a specific kind of erosion. Men and women who told an emperor what he wanted to hear gradually shaped the environment until the emperor could no longer easily hear anything else. Marcus fought this by maintaining the philosophical practice, by keeping the notes, by continuing to see Sextus of Chaeronea for philosophical instruction even as an old man on campaign, a choice that astonished his contemporaries and that he made specifically because the court could not provide what Sextus could. He knew what the court was doing to the space in which honest thought was possible, and he worked against it deliberately, and he still noted in the Meditations that it was not always working. The plague presented a dimension of failure that the philosophy was not designed to prevent. 5 million people died. He could not stop it. Stoicism said, "The things outside your control are not your responsibility. Your responsibility is only what you do within the limits of what you can affect." He had done what he could, maintained the administration, recruited the army, sold the palace furniture, invited settlers to the abandoned farmland. He could not make the disease stop. The Meditations of this period return to death with a frequency and a specific texture that suggests a man who has seen enough of it that the philosophical framework for accepting it is being tested against something the framework was not built for. Not one's own death, which philosophy can address relatively cleanly, but the deaths of people who depended on him, whom he could not protect, and whose loss the Stoic framework called indifferent. It is possible to hold an idea as true and still find it insufficient in the specific moment it is required. The Marcomannic Wars cost him his health in a way that is documented in Galen's records and implied in the Meditations. The entries about the difficulty of getting out of bed, about the body's reluctance and the mind's requirement to override it, were written by a man whose body was genuinely failing. Galen's notes from the frontier years describe a man managing chronic chest and stomach complaints with a daily medication regimen, unable to eat without pharmaceutical support, i.e. constitutionally fragile in conditions designed to test men who were constitutionally strong. The Meditations say nothing about this directly. They say, instead, that the body's condition is indifferent, that what is within your control is the quality of your response, that the question is only what a human being does with the time and capacity allotted by nature. He wrote that, while he was the man it was written about, which requires a specific quality of commitment to the idea that the philosophy is not claiming. Faustina's death in 175 in a village in Cappadocia during the tour of the East produced a grief that Marcus expressed in the only way his public life permitted, by naming the village after her, establishing a charity in her memory, arranging her deification. But he had written in the Meditations that he thanked the gods for giving him such a wife, calling her obedient, affectionate, simple. The ancient accounts accuse Faustina of infidelity with gladiators and senators and generals, including possibly with Avidius Cassius, in a way that contributed to the revolt that nearly ended Marcus's reign. Marcus wrote nothing about any of this privately or publicly. Either he did not believe the rumors, or he believed them and chose not to act on them, or he had reached a position with respect to things outside his control that allowed him to sit with a marriage that was complicated and grieve its end anyway. The Meditations do not resolve which of these was true. They preserve instead the evidence of a man who had decided that the quality of a relationship was determined by what he brought to it, not by what he received. The Commodus Decision cannot be read without reading the Meditations alongside it, and what the Meditations reveal when read alongside it is not hypocrisy, not a gap between what Marcus said and what he did that proves the philosophy was hollow. They reveal something more specific. A man who understood the Stoic standard for this choice perfectly well, who had the intelligence and the self-awareness to know what the choice cost, and who made it anyway, for reasons that the philosophy condemned and that the man could not resist. The Meditations say that external goods, wealth, safety, the lives of your children are indifferent to your real well-being. The Commodus Decision says, I know, and I cannot quite make myself act on it. The philosophy survived the empire in the form of the notes. The empire was left to Commodus. Marcus Aurelius understood the difference between those two outcomes and wrote honestly about both. There is a passage in the Meditations that describes a man who has not done what he set out to do, who has been neither a philosopher in the academic sense nor a ruler in the ideal sense, but something in between, something that managed to satisfy neither standard completely. The passage reads like a man giving himself permission, late in the project, to be what he actually was rather than what he had intended to be at the start. A number of scholars have suggested this represents Marcus making peace with his limitations. The reading seems right, but it is also possible to read it as something else. As a man who spent 19 years discovering that the gap between the Stoic standard and what any actual human being could manage was permanent and irreducible, and who decided that the right response to that discovery was not to lower the standard but to keep working against it imperfectly, honestly, without the comfort of pretending the imperfection was something else. The Meditations are full of the machinery of failure management, not because Marcus Aurelius was a weak man, but because the tasks he had set himself were genuinely difficult, and the circumstances in which he was attempting them were genuinely catastrophic. He governed an empire under plague for 15 years. He commanded armies for a decade without prior military experience. He maintained the administrative machinery of the world's largest state from the conditions of a frontier camp in a northern winter. He held a philosophy that demanded of him that every one of these things be accepted without distress as simply what nature had assigned, and he held it with enough consistency that Cassius Dio, who was not given to sentimentality about emperors, said he admired Marcus the more for having done this in circumstances that had made every part of it harder. The standard was impossible. The attempt was remarkable. The notes are what remarkable looks like from the inside. What the Meditations reveal about Marcus Aurelius, read carefully against the biography, is not what the popular reception has decided they reveal. They do not reveal a wise man who found the answers. They reveal a man who spent 20 years learning the questions and then spent 19 years discovering that knowing the questions was not the same as being able to answer them in the specific circumstances of an actual reign. The plague was not a philosophical problem. The Marcomannic Wars were not a philosophical problem. The Cassius Revolt and the Commodus Decision and the death of children and the erosion of a body under campaign conditions, none of these were problems that the Stoic framework, however sincerely held, resolved. What it provided was something more modest and more durable, a method for returning to the attempt each morning, which is what the notes document entry after entry from the early years in Rome to the last winter on the Danube. He had told himself since his 20s that the purple dye was something to be careful of, that a man could drown in it without noticing, that the apparatus of power had a tendency to replace the reality of character with a performance of it. 19 years of evidence suggest he was largely right about the danger and largely successful at resisting it, not perfectly, not without the specific failures the Meditations record, but consistently enough that both his enemies and his admirers during his reign called him a philosopher, and meant it, even when they intended it as a criticism. He had made himself accountable to a standard that no court official or public ceremony could enforce, and he had enforced it privately, in notes that no one was supposed to read, against a record of days that he consistently judged insufficient. The cost of the Meditations was, finally, that they told the truth. Not about Stoicism in the abstract, anyone could do that, but about what Stoicism looks like in practice when the practice runs across 2 decades of specific historical catastrophe and one man's specific human limitations. It looks like the notes. It looks like returning to the same problems because the problems are still there. It looks like the distance between the standard and the actual being smaller on some days than others, and never quite closing. It looks like a man who understood what he was attempting and kept attempting it, and who wrote the attempt down in a language his court could not easily read, because the attempt was the most private thing he had, and the most honest, and the most his. In the winter of 179 A.D., Marcus Aurelius was at Vindobona, the legionary fortress at what is now Vienna, conducting the final phase of the Marcomannic Wars. He was 58 years old. He had been emperor for 18 years. He had been at war for 14 of them. Galen's records from this period describe a man whose constitution had been progressively worn away by the combined demands of campaign conditions, chronic illness, and the particular exhaustion that comes from holding a difficult standard over a very long time. The Antonine Plague that had run through the empire since 165 had not stopped. It was almost certainly still present in the camp at Vindobona that winter, moving through the close quarters of the barracks and the hospital the way it had moved through everything else. Commodus was there, 19 years old, already showing the advisors and generals around him what the next reign would look like. Marcus died on the 17th of March, 180 A.D. in his military quarters at Vindobona. The cause, with near certainty, was the plague, the same disease that had been his constant administrative companion for 15 years, that had gutted his army, that had given the Germanic tribes the opening they needed to cross the Danube, that had killed perhaps 5 million of his subjects, and that had, according to some ancient accounts, infected him in the epidemic wave of 164 or 165 before anyone understood how long it would run. He did not die in Rome. He did not die in a palace. He died where he had spent most of his reign, in a camp on the frontier, wearing out the last of a body that had never been strong. Doing the last thing he would have chosen to be doing, which was also the only thing he felt he could honestly do. The accounts of his final days are fragmentary and filtered through the literary conventions of a genre that liked deathbed scenes to be instructive. He is said to have told soldiers who came to his bedside to go to the rising sun, for he was setting. He is said to have sent Commodus away from the room, fearing contagion. He is said to have made the Stoic philosophers preparations, not resignation exactly, but the specific kind of active acceptance that distinguishes a man who has thought carefully about death from a man who has simply stopped being afraid of it. What the Meditations tell us about his preparation for death is more reliable than any deathbed account. He had been preparing for it for decades, returning to it in entry after entry, not as an obsession, but as a tool, using the fact of death to sharpen the present. He was immediately deified. His ashes were returned to Rome and placed in the mausoleum of Hadrian, where they remained until the Visigoth sack of the city in 410. Within weeks of his death, Commodus had negotiated peace on the Danube on terms that abandoned the plans for the new provinces Marcus had been building toward for years. Within months, he was in Rome. Within 2 years, Lucilla was conspiring to have him killed. Within 5, senators were dying. The column of Marcus Aurelius, which still stands in the Piazza Colonna in Rome, was erected after his death to commemorate the Marcomannic Wars. Its carved spiral of relief scenes, Romans crossing the Danube, cavalry in Germanic territory, the emperor addressing his troops, was the public version of what the reign had looked like from the outside. The private version was in the notes that survived in a single manuscript, nearly falling to pieces, found by a bishop in the 10th century. The question of what Marcus Aurelius actually means, what his example is evidence of, what the Meditations actually demonstrate, is one that each era has answered differently, and none of the answers have quite satisfied the question. Gibbon, in the 18th century, called his dynasty's period the moment when the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous, and the judgment reveals as much about the 18th century as about the second. The version that has dominated the modern reception, Marcus as the philosopher king, proof that wisdom and power can coexist, the Meditations as a guidebook to a better life, is a reading that the Meditations themselves consistently resist if read carefully. What the Meditations say is not that the thing is possible. They say that the attempt is worth making, which is a different claim. The more honest reading of Marcus Aurelius is that he was a demonstration of what happens when someone tries very hard, over a very long time, under very bad conditions, to hold a philosophical standard that the conditions were designed to erode. Not a demonstration of success, the Meditations are explicit about failure, about returning to the same problems, about the gap between the ideal and the actual never closing. But a demonstration of the attempt, which is what the philosophy said was the point. Stoicism did not promise its practitioners that they would achieve wisdom. It offered a method for working toward it indefinitely, without the comfort of completion. The Meditations are that method documented, and their remarkable quality is not that they describe a man who mastered the method, but that they preserve, in private, the evidence of a man who could not quite master it and kept going anyway. Cassius Dio's final judgment on Marcus Aurelius is worth sitting with, because Dio was not a flatterer and was writing from the perspective of a senator who had lived through the reign of Commodus and knew exactly what came after Marcus. He said that Marcus had not met with the good fortune he deserved, that he had been involved in a multitude of troubles throughout almost his entire reign, that he had survived them and preserved the empire. And he said he admired Marcus the more for this, not for his success, but for his persistence in the face of circumstances that had made success in any conventional sense unavailable. Dio was not describing a philosopher king who had achieved what he set out to achieve. He was describing a man who had refused to stop trying when stopping was entirely justified. The legacy that Marcus left was not what he would have identified as his legacy if asked. He would have identified the new Danubian provinces, Marcomannia and Sarmatia, the permanent settlement of the northern frontier problem that had consumed 19 years of his reign. Those were abandoned by Commodus within months of his death. He might have identified the legal reforms, or the improvements to the administration of estates and the protections for orphans and widows and slaves. These persisted for longer, embedded in the legal traditions that outlasted Rome itself by centuries. He would probably not have identified the notes. He had explicitly not intended them for anyone else. They were the private record of a private practice, and their survival into the hands of a Byzantine bishop was the kind of contingency that a Stoic would have called indifferent, not planned, not earned, simply what happened to happen. What happened to happen is that a document of remarkable honesty survived the fall of Rome, the Byzantine centuries, the near destruction of classical manuscripts during the medieval period, the theft and loss of manuscripts across the early modern era, brutal, and eventually found its way into print in 1559 from a manuscript that has since been lost. What we read today is reconstructed from copies of copies, stripped of whatever context Marcus's contemporaries would have brought to it, translated from a language that died with the empire that produced it. And it is still, by many measurements, the most intimate document to survive from the ancient world, the only extended private record of what it felt like, from the inside, to be a Roman emperor attempting to live by a philosophy that the role of emperor was structurally designed to make impossible. The word that a sympathetic reader might reach for, encountering the Meditations alongside the biography, is courage, not the military courage of a man on a battlefield. Marcus had something like that by the end. But it was acquired rather than natural, and he would have been the first to say so. The courage that the Meditations document is quieter and more demanding. The courage to hold yourself to a standard that you know you will fail to meet, to note the failure, honestly, without using it as an excuse to lower the standard and to return to the attempt the next morning. To do this in private, with no audience, with no institutional incentive, with everything the court and the war and the plague providing reasons to stop. To keep the notes for a decade or more in a succession of military camps, never intending anyone to find them, because the practice was the point and not the record. That is what the Meditations cost and what they demonstrate. The question that this life opens, what does it cost a man to hold a philosophy and an empire at the same time, and which one survives, has an answer, but the answer is not simple. The empire survived, though not in the form Marcus had hoped for. Commodus dismantled the frontier plan, and the Antonine dynasty ended 12 years after Marcus died, and the 3rd century that followed was one of near-continuous civil war. The philosophy survived in the notes, printed for the first time in 1559, read by Frederick the Great and John Stuart Mill and Matthew Arnold and Goethe, and millions of anonymous readers in every century since, and now available in paperback in every airport in the world. Between those two survival records, the philosophy has outlasted the empire by roughly 1,500 years and shows no sign of stopping. But the more honest version of the answer is that neither survived cleanly. The empire that Marcus preserved was already compromised. The Commodus Decision was already made. The plague had already done its demographic damage. The 3rd century crisis was already implicit in the structural pressures that Marcus had managed but not resolved. And the philosophy that survived in the Meditations was not the philosophy Marcus would have wanted to demonstrate. He wanted to demonstrate that a man could hold both a philosophy and an empire without either one destroying the other. The Meditations demonstrate instead that the holding was genuinely difficult, that the philosophy helped and was insufficient, and that a man of unusual sincerity and intelligence, working at both for 19 years, he could manage something imperfect and honest and worth the effort. That is, in the end, the more interesting demonstration. He had told himself, in the Meditations, that the great men who came before him, Augustus, Hadrian, Antoninus, the philosophers he had read and admired, were all gone, dissolved back into the elements, remembered only as names, even their names gradually fading. He had used this as a tool for proportion. Whatever seemed significant now would also dissolve, and the quality of how he behaved in the present was the only thing that could not be taken from him. He wrote this knowing he would also dissolve, that Marcus Aurelius would also become a name, and then a footnote, and then nothing. He was right about everything except the timing. The dissolution has been slower than he predicted. And the notes he never meant anyone to find are still being read by people who find in them, against all probability, something that helps. He died on the frontier, doing the work. The notes were found. The empire dissolved. The notes were copied. The empire was sacked and converted and subdivided and forgotten. The notes were printed. The empire became a subject for historians. The notes became a subject for anyone who needed them, which turned out to be more people than anyone would have predicted. What Marcus Aurelius actually was, not the icon of popular philosophy, not the failed father of Commodus, not the reluctant warrior of the Danube, was a man who spent 19 years discovering what philosophy is actually for, not for achieving wisdom, for surviving the days when wisdom is not available, and returning, the next morning, to the attempt. The empire ended. The attempt is still going.